We're going to talk about today's discussion is about unemployment. Unemployment is a very important topic when it comes to the sort of exams, because um, it is commonly tested, and it is an important sort of macroeconomic measure. So from that perspective, when you look at how economy is performing, unemployment is one of the things that we look at. Today's class will be the introduction class, where we talk about basically what do we mean by unemployment, how do we measure unemployment, and also simply looking at the total demand and total supply in a macroeconomic sense of labor, and therefore understanding unemployment with that perspective. Okay, so that's our first class. So when you look at total unemployment, by definition, the unemployed are who those people who are basically of working age. So that's one thing. You have to be of working age, which means you should be basically, if you look at Pakistan's definition, you should be greater than basically 15 years old, but less than 65. If that's the case, then you will be basically of working age. That's the definition of working age. And if you are of working age and without work, so if you're willing and able to work, and so sort of willing is basically also important, because if you're looking for work and you are without work, then you will be called unemployed. So unemployed are those who are of working age and are without work but are available for work, which means they're willing to work. Okay, so that's one thing to understand. And then second thing to understand is this, that when we look at unemployed, we look at basically anyone who's above 15 and less than 65. Let's say if you look at this table, this is Pakistan's labor force data. If you then look at this table, Pakistan adult population in 2010, if you look at 2010, in 2010 was 90 million. Of the 90 million, by the way, there is also another population called your total population. Your total population in this time, when your adult population was 90 million, was roughly 160 million. So this means that there were also 70 million people who were dependent population. These dependent population means they're less than 15 or greater than 64. So people who are less than 15 and greater than 64 are those 70 million people. So 90 plus 70, we have a total population of 160 million. So if you look at 160 million people out there, guys, if you look at 160 million people out there, 47 million of those people are employed. Okay, and 2.47 million are unemployed. So if you add 47 plus 2.47 million employed plus unemployed, you have what we call total labor force. And of this population of 47 plus 2.47, you're looking at basically total labor force of 49.9 million people. And this 49.9 million people also includes basically includes both the people who are willing and able to work and working, and those who are not working but are willing and able to work. But there are some people who are probably in our adult population, which is basically above 15 and less than 65, who are not in labor force. These are people who are of working age but not willing to work. Sometimes you guys are basically above 15 but you are in A levels, you are willing, you are basically those of working age but you're not working, you will be part of this labor force. Or for example, housewives, or for example, anyone who's in university, or anyone for any reason who is not wanting to work yet is more than 15 and less than 65. So basically, when we look at our population data, we are of 2010. If somebody asks you what's your unemployment rate, अनएम्प्लॉयमेंट रेट का फॉर्मूला होता है, द फॉर्मूला इज टोटल अनएम्प्लॉयड, which is basically 2.42 divided by total labor force, which is basically 49.98, which equals to basically 4.84%. So unemployment rate is simply unemployed over total labor force. The second data that we find out from after unemployment rate, is called participation rate. What is participation rate? Participation rate is basically you're looking at let's write this. Participation rate is basically looking at total labor force over total adult population. You know how many people who are basically wanting to work and are working, which is basically your 49.98 divided by 49.98 49.98 divided by 90.53, which is the total adult population, which is this one, which means 55.2% of the people who are actually uh, are sort of willing to work. So 55.2% are those people who are willing and able to work and are working, divided by basically as compared to the total population, which is basically total adult population, which is basically those who are willing and able to work and are probably working and not working. Does that make sense, guys? Do we get the participation rate? So participation rate is looking at how many people are basically participating in the labor force. It includes basically also those people. So we basically adult population includes everyone who is between 15 and 65, while labor force is all those who are 15 and 65 and are wanting to work. And labor force includes unemployed as well. Now then comes dependency ratio. But before I move on to dependency ratio, I want to ask you guys if you have any questions, anything that doesn't make sense. Let's look at dependency ratio. What is dependency ratio? Dependency ratio is basically how much of your dependent population, which is your population uh, less than 15 and greater than sort of 64, basically 65 and above, are, in this case, Pakistan has 70 million of those people in 2010, of how much of your dependent population as compared to adult population is out there. Adult population are those who are basically can work, and the answer for this one will be 90 other people who are 90 million other people who are in adult population. So the number will be 7 is to 9 or 0.78 is to 1. So that will be your adult population. So our dependency ratio will be 0.78 is to 1. Does that make sense, guys? This means that for every one person who can work, we'll have 0.78% who is basically is supporting 0.78 who cannot work. Make sense, guys? Any questions before we move on? So these three things that we look at, number one is your unemployment rate. Number two is your participation rate. And the last one is your dependency ratio. Let's move on to talk about now how do we calculate unemployment. But before I do that, I want to ask you guys if you guys have any questions. So next we want to move on to talk about how do we measure unemployment. So there are two ways of measuring unemployment. The first method is what we call um, claimant count. Basically, uh, all those claiming unemployment benefits. That's the first method of going about it. The second method is basically what we call the ILO measure or the labor force survey. Okay, which is basically looking at um, unemployment, which is looking at basically unemployment through a labor force survey. Okay, so when you look at claimant count, in a claimant count situation, you're looking at all those who are receiving or claiming unemployment benefits. So if you receive unemployment benefit, you will basically be you will basically be called unemployed. The only thing is this, that this method gives you a very easy way to collect unemployed. Simply you just make a call, find out, okay, how many of you are basically unemployed, and once you find that out, you will be able to look at sort of the number of people unemployed. Adrian, let me go back to your question in a little while, okay? So once you know the number of people who are getting unemployment benefit, you get yourself people who are unemployed. The fact is that sometimes you might be unemployed. Okay, what if you are unemployed and you are not claiming benefits. If you're not claiming benefit, this method will not give you the right answer. Also, if you're unemployed and you are not qualifying for unemployment benefit, let's say you're not eligible for benefits, because let's say the rule is that, let's say if your wife is working and you are not working, that you don't get it. So if you're not eligible for benefits, or let's say you don't claim benefits, that means you must be unemployed, but basically this method is not telling you the right answer. So also, if what if the government changes the eligibility condition? Let's say government says to say, like from now onward, only people who are below a certain income group will get unemployment benefits. So if that's the case, then basically claimant count becomes what we call an inaccurate measure of measurement, because it mean basically only looks at those who get the unemployment benefits, which means anyone who's not claiming it, or anyone who is not eligible, or anyone who is denied because of eligibility conditions will be not part of the total measure of unemployment. So by just counting those people who are claiming unemployment benefits as people who are unemployed may be a bad measure in terms of comparing across countries, or between different time periods and so on. So that's why sometimes it is a calculation that understate the true level of unemployment in a country. Does that make sense? Are we good? Then comes what we call ILO, or labor force survey. In the ILO or labor force survey, basically we define unemployed as those who are able for and seeking work while currently without work. So there is what we call a consistent definition of unemployed. We undertake an extensive and standardized labor force survey. So we have a very extensive labor force survey, which helps us to figure out who is unemployed. And the advantage of this kind of a survey is just that because it's standardized and it's extensive, it can give you a very good measure of the total people unemployed in a country. The only downside of this method is just that this method is kind of very expensive. When you are taking a countrywide survey, there could be much more expenditure done to actually find unemployment in a proper way. And also, because it's a survey, it could have statistical and other errors that can be combined here. Are we good? Does that make sense, guys? Are we good with this kind of a thing? So ILO measure could be a very good measure for comparing unemployment across time periods and between countries and so on. Any question before we move on? Does that make sense, guys? So this is basically the two methods that are out there. One is simply looking at claimant count, which is number of people who are unemployed and getting benefits. And the second one is through ILO measure, which is through a definition, and then you find it through surveys and so on. Okay. Now that we know how do we calculate unemployment and what is unemployment rate, let's look at basically a simple structure of demand and supply of labor. When you look at demand and supply of labor, on my x-axis, I have what we call quantity of labor. And on my y-axis, because I'm looking at the aggregate demand and aggregate supply of labor, I have average real wage rate. Real means controlling for inflation. Okay. Average, basically why I'm finding average, because I'm looking at all the sectors of the country, all the various workers out there. So I'm looking at the average. So look at average real wage rate along with your quantity of labor. So what we say is just that where demand meets supply, you get your equilibrium wage rate. But there are a couple of things that I want to talk about. Number one, AD is downward sloping. So I want to talk about that. Why is AD downward sloping for labor? AS is also upward sloping. So we're going to talk about that. And the third thing we talk about is this, that AS is relatively inelastic. Three things we want to talk about. AS is relatively inelastic. AD is downward sloping. AS is upward sloping. So guys, Why is AD downward sloping? AD is downward sloping simply because when your wage rate goes down, you know this, labor becomes relatively cheaper. And when labor becomes relatively cheaper, automatically quantity of labor supplied will quantity of labor demanded will go up. So when your labor becomes cheaper, more firms will be demanding labor, making quantity labor demanded to go up. So that's why AD curve is downward sloping. Does that make sense? The second question we need to ask is, why is AS curve upward sloping? AS curve is simply upward sloping because, remember, this is workers' perspective. When the wage rate goes up, it gives more incentive for people to work longer, and basically for people who are unemployed to join labor market. Why? Because simply opportunity cost of sitting at home goes up. So if I'm a housewife and suddenly wage rates are going up, I'll be like, what? Why not just work longer? Because now the incentive to work has gone up. So unemployed may want to join the labor market more so because the wage rate is going up. But why is AS curve relatively inelastic? That's the last question we're going to ask us. AS curve, why is it inelastic? And the reason why AS curve is relatively inelastic is simply because of the fact that at any point, let me write this, in fact, on this side, at any point, the total number of workers available is relatively constant. There are not many people, workers that are out there to start with. The number is relatively fixed or constant because it's it's a factor that basically means the total labor force at any point in time cannot change significantly because you have a fixed factor. So the AD is downward sloping, AS is upward sloping but inelastic because at any point the labor force is relatively constant. Um, but when your wage rate goes up, A, more people would want to join the labor market if they're sitting at home, and B, those who are working will want to work longer hours. So that's also possible. Okay, does that make sense? Are we good with this concept? Because these are the three things I want to talk about. I want to talk about the next thing, which is going to talk about the total labor force curve, which is going to build upon this one. But before I talk about that, I'm going to talk about this in the next class. But before I talk about that, I want to show you the diagram. Uh, is there any question anyone has before we move on? Are we going to move on? Okay, great. Guys, this is something which I'm going to explain tomorrow. But I want to talk about this in a possible thing that sometimes we make AD and AS, but we also make this N curve, which is called your total labor force curve. This total labor force curve is basically looking at both unemployed plus employed. Okay, something which I'm going to talk about tomorrow, but that's where I'm going to end today's class. But I want to also take on some questions. So let me just pause recording.